Hello everyone, and welcome to the lecture on histograms. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to create histograms with R and the ggplot2 package. We're going to first start off with installing ggplot2. We'll also install a dataset related to ggplot2 called the ggplot2 movies dataset. And before we actually start coding anything, I'm going to show you a great cheat sheet resource that RStudio provides for you for working with ggplot2. Okay, I'm super excited to show you all this, so let's go ahead and jump to RStudio. Okay, so here we are at RStudio. Let's go ahead and start off by installing the packages we need. You're going to need to install ggplot2. So to start off, we'll just go ahead and in the console you can say install.packages. In quotes, go ahead and pass ggplot2. That should take a little while to download and install, so I'm going to go ahead and fast forward and jump to when it's done installing. I'm going to go ahead and jump now. Okay, so it's finished installing. Second thing we're going to need to do, let me go ahead and just copy and paste this line and comment it up here in the script in case you need to reference it. It's also in the notes. Second thing I want to say is install.packages, and I'm going to go ahead and say ggplot2 movies. And that's going to go ahead and install the dataset that we're going to be working with. Alright, that one's done. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste it as a comment up here in the script, so you can go ahead and pause the video, reference this if you need it. Okay, so before we get started on actually coding out a histogram, what I want to show you is jump to my browser, or your favorite browser real quick, and find a cheat sheet that's going to be super useful for working with ggplot2. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the browser now. Okay, so I'm here in my browser and I went ahead and Google searched RStudio ggplot cheat sheet. So I'm zoomed in right now on the results, but if you just Google RStudio ggplot cheat sheet, the first link here should be the ggplot2 cheat sheet developed by RStudio. So not that RStudio developed ggplot2, but that they created this cheat sheet. Although Hadley Wickham does actually work for RStudio, so keep that in mind. Anyways, if we go ahead and jump to the cheat sheet, we have a wonderful PDF cheat sheet to work with as far as the different varieties of plots we can make with ggplot2. And it gives you a couple of nice formulas to follow as far as creating your plots. We won't have enough time to go over every single one of these plot types, but we will go over enough plot types where you can eventually just reference this cheat sheet or even the documentation for plot types that you're looking for and know immediately how to create them. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is a histogram. So if we look throughout this cheat sheet, right here we can see that we have a histogram method. So if I go ahead and zoom in a bit, notice here, center screen, we have geom_histogram. So our data and aesthetics layers are going to be really similar almost every single time. We'll either have just an X or an X and Y, depending on what kind of plot we want to create. But then after that, what we're really going to have to decide on is what kind of geometry layer we want. And in this case, you'll probably reference this cheat sheet or the documentation and find the geometry layer that you're looking for. And they have a nice little mini visualization here, so you can reference like, oh yes, I want a histogram since I'm looking for some sort of frequency plot. Okay, let's go ahead and jump back to RStudio. Again, make sure you download this cheat sheet and reference it. And I'm going to go ahead, jump back to RStudio, and let's start plotting out a histogram. Okay, we made it back to RStudio. First thing I'm going to do is call in the libraries I'm going to need, ggplot2, and then for the data set, I'm going to need call library, ggplot2 movies. Again, there's no quotes since we're calling a library here, so just keep that in mind. First layer that we're going to create in our grammar of graphics philosophy is the data layer and then the aesthetics layer. So data and aesthetics is what we're going to look for right now. So we start off by saying ggplot, and then the first thing we're going to do is pass in our data. Now our data is going to be movies. Movies is a data frame that comes with this ggplot2 movies. So you can go ahead and just put movies there, or you can assign movies to a df or some data frame variable and pass in the variable here. But in this case, we'll just go ahead and say movies. In order for this to work, you'll have to install and call the ggplot2 movies dataset. Next thing we want to do is aesthetics. Now the syntax for aesthetics is a little strange because you're not adding it as a new layer, you're actually putting it into this initial ggplot function. So just keep that in mind. And aesthetics is going to be whether you want x, y, and what variables you want for x and y. So in order to get an idea of what we actually want to put in as aesthetics, what I'm going to go ahead and do is in the console, call column names on my movies dataset, just so I can get an idea of the movies. Whoops, and the first thing I have to do, like I mentioned before, is actually call ggplot2 movies. The reason I have to call it in the console is because I actually haven't run the script yet. Okay, so I called that. Now let's try that again. All right, so calling all the column names off of movies, I have the title of a movie, the year, the length, rating, etc. Let's go ahead and call head of movies. Take a look at this. So notice I have the title of a movie, such as $1,000 touchdown or something, 21 day once a month, etc. Climax show. I have years that they came out, the length of the movie, budget's a movie. In this case, a lot of these have nulls there. The rating of a movie might be an interesting one for a histogram, so we can see kind of the frequency of ratings. So I have my ratings column. Let's go ahead and build a histogram off of the ratings column. I'm going to go ahead and clear the console so we can continue working. So in this case, I'll say x equals rating. I won't pass in a y because of histograms. We're just going to plot out the frequency of a single feature or variable or column in our data frame. And in order to really put the idea of the layers of the grammar of graphics to good use, I'm going to assign this to PL variable. So I have my data and aesthetics layer. I'm then going to add in my geometries layer. Geometry, and then that layer will be PL plus geom underscore. And if you just type geom underscore, RStudio is going to show you all your options for geometries. There are a ton of options here. So usually you'll have to either in your help search for geom, and you'll get a result that looks like this, and you can go ahead and check out the descriptions of each of these geometry layers, or you can reference that cheat sheet that I showed you earlier. Let's go ahead and jump to it real quick. So here's the cheat sheet I showed earlier, and what you would do is kind of look around and say, okay, I have one variable that I'm trying to plot. It's a continuous variable because it's a rating, so the ratings go from, let's say, 0 to 10 continuously, and I want to create a histogram. So then I want to create a plot that looks like this, and you figure out, oh, I need to do geom underscore histogram. Don't worry if you don't totally understand that yet. As we go over more and more of these examples, you'll start to get really familiar as far as using this cheat sheet or the documentation to figure out what geometry layer to call. Okay, so we decided we'll call geom underscore histogram as our geometry layer. Let's jump back to RStudio. Here we are, RStudio. I'm going to go ahead and call geom histogram. I won't pass any additional arguments in the histogram for now. Let's go ahead and run the source here. And if we go ahead and go to plots, you'll notice nothing actually comes out. Reason for that being is you have to actually print out whatever you actually want to plot. So in this case, I want to say PL plus geom histogram, print that out. Let's go ahead and run source again. And now we actually do get the plot. So this is what the very basics of a histogram look like. We have a continuous one variable plot that goes from 0 to 10, and we have a histogram which is just the counts. So it's essentially showing the frequency of these ratings. So we have maybe around 2,000-ish counts of, I don't know, 7.6-ish ratings. So the most common rating is around a 6. And we can see that the least common rating are either 0s or 10s, which makes sense. You don't have perfect movies, and you don't have that many super awful movies. Now we can begin to add arguments into our geometry layer in order to customize our plot. So if we take a quick peek again at that cheat sheet, I'll jump to it now. We see we have additional arguments such as bin width. Whoops, sorry about that. We have bin width equals 5, maybe that's a default, etc. that we can use. But we also have X, Y, alpha, color, fill, line type, size, weight, etc. So what we're going to go ahead and do is play around with some of these extra geometry arguments and see how they affect our plot. Let's go ahead and jump back to RStudio. Notice in RStudio when we actually printed out this plot, we got a little statement here that said stat bin using bins equals 30, pick better value with bin width. And what that basically means is you can edit the width of these bins if you want to get more granular information on these counts. So what we're going to go ahead and do is just that. I'm going to add the argument bin width, and we know that's an argument because we checked out that cheat sheet. And let's go ahead and say 0.1. So that means I want every bin in my plot to have a width of 0.1 units. And the unit in this case is rating. Now let's go ahead and run this source. And now you can see I have a lot more bins. So now my information is actually clearer than last time. So last time we had 30 bins. Now I can get a little more granular on that information of the histogram and get a better picture of what's actually going on. We can also begin to add things such as color and fill arguments into our geometry layer. So let's go ahead and try doing that. We added bin width. If I say color equals, I can pass in a string of basic colors. So for instance, I can say color equals red. Let's go ahead and run that source. And now you'll notice, if you can make it out, that each of the outside lines of this histogram is colored red. If you actually want to affect the fill color of this histogram, you'll have to pass in fill. So let's go ahead and add that in. We might go to another line here. So we'll say fill equals, let's go ahead and say pink. And then make sure we have enough parentheses. Go ahead and run this. And now we have a red outline for our color, and our fill is pink. So there's tons of arguments we can keep adding to this geometry layer. I'll show you one more common one, and that's alpha. What the alpha argument allows us to do, it's all the way here on the right, but what it allows us to do is set the transparency of our plotted data. So if I set alpha equal to 0, that means it's fully transparent. So you see there's no more fill there. If I set it to 1, which is essentially the default, that means it's totally opaque. So I can't make out the lines, those grid lines behind the plot. So if I actually want to try to make out those grid lines, I'll say something like 0.4. And now I can kind of both see the fill and the grid lines. So that's alpha for transparency. So these are going to be really common arguments with a histogram. You'll probably specify the bin width, the color, the fill, and then maybe some sort of transparency. Now let's talk about adding labels. So adding some more layers. What I'm going to go ahead and do is assign all of this to PL2. So we have our geometry layer, and then I'm going to, since that line is getting kind of long, I'll start adding stuff to PL2 for printing purposes. So we get PL2, and I'm going to go ahead and add labels to this plot. So right now the labels are defaulted to count and rating. Count because it's counting the number of times each of these ratings show up, and this rating is just because that was the name of the column. We said X equals rating. But let's say we actually wanted to set our own X labels and Y labels, maybe even titles. The arguments you're going to add, and this kind of goes with the coordinates or facets kind of layer. We're going to say XLAB, parentheses, and then pass in a string of whatever you want the X label to be. So in this case, let's go ahead and pass in movie rating. And then for Y label, it's going to be really similar. You're going to say plus Y LAB, and then we're going to go ahead and say, let's just say count with a capital C, since that's essentially still what it is. And now let's assign all of this to PL3, and then print PL3. And the reason I'm doing all these assignments is just so you can easily read this. So we have our data and aesthetics. We go ahead and play around with our geometry till we get something that looks nice to us, and then we go ahead and add X labels and Y labels. Let's try running the source, see what it looks like. I have an error. Looks like I accidentally added a parentheses here. Let me go ahead and remove that. Okay, now let's run from source. There we go. So if you can make it out here, this axis has been changed to a movie rating, and the y-axis is capital C count now. Just to show that it's really clear, we'll go ahead and say my count. In case it's too small to see, you can probably see if I add 2 words there. We run it, now we can see we have my count. Okay, we have a nice plot. We have our own X label, our own Y label. Let's just add a title to this plot. So maybe you want an overall title up here on top of the plot. The way you can do that is by adding GG title and then just passing a string. I'll go ahead and just put in all caps my title, run the source here, and once this source is done running, we can see my title has popped up in this new plot. You can go ahead and go back and forth between your old plots by clicking on these arrows, so just keep that in mind. Finally, let me go ahead and show you how you can actually save these plots. So once you have a plot that you like, you go ahead and click here on Export, and you can save as image, save as PDF, or copy to the clipboard. This means if you are working with maybe some Excel data that you just imported into R, want to make a nice custom plot in R, and then maybe paste it back into a Word document or an Excel document, you can either save it as an image, save it as a PDF, or actually just straight copy to your clipboard and then paste it into whatever document you're working in. So you have some 3 options that are really nice for you to work with. And you can go ahead and clean up your history of plots by clicking on this broom here. All right, so what have we learned so far? We learned how to create our basic plot with ggplot. We have our data and aesthetics layer. Then we have our geometry layer. Again, how do we find this geometry layer? Well, you can either reference the documentation or you can search that cheat sheet that I showed you earlier. We added some additional arguments to play around with our geometry layer, including things such as color, fill, and alpha for transparency. And then we went ahead and added some X labels with XLab, a Y label with YLab, and then a title of GG title. All right, before we completely finish this lecture, I just want to show you an advanced aesthetics technique that you can actually apply to the geometry layer in order to fill out your histogram based on the count or occurrence number of your y-axis in this case. So don't worry if you don't fully understand this syntax, but I just want to show you what's possible with ggplot and how cool it is. I'm going to go ahead and come back here to my geom_histogram, and I'm going to add AES, and this is going to affect the fill of the geometry layer. So I'll say aesthetics fill ... count ... and this is kind of a special way to fill out the color of your histogram based on the count of the histogram. So let's go ahead and run this from the source. And now you'll notice that as my count gets higher here, my blue color becomes lighter. And as the count is lower, the blue color becomes darker. So that's kind of a more advanced technique. Don't worry if you don't fully understand this. We'll go over these more advanced aesthetic techniques later. But hopefully you can see now just how powerful ggplot is to make some really cool looking plots. Okay, this advanced technique is also in the notes in case you want to reference the code for it. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.